Did you say you called it Old House Soul?
Old House Soul, yeah.
Can you just say a little bit more about that? It's interesting. I've never heard that term.
Never heard that term?
Except in Ann Baker's book, I think she.
Yeah, she refers to it. She refers to it.
Yeah, well, she got that from me.
Huh.
Well, she uses it in reference to you. So.
Yeah,
Does use it in reference.
that's why.
So,
Yeah, it's Old House Soul. I don't know. It's like I've defined it in the past as having a perverse fondness for old wood. You know, I don't know. It's I don't know what you call it. It maybe being what? I don't know. Blah. When I came back from Connecticut after I was working down there for a couple of years, I came back and someone asked me to play basketball on a Monday morning at the Boys Club in Pawtucket, and I was living in Providence at the time, and I said, sure, I'll meet you down there at 9 o'clock. Well, I ended up showing up about 9:45 because I got lost. Nothing was familiar. The streets had all changed. The White Tower was gone. The Hot Weenie joint was gone. There was a new ring road around the city. I got into that area where I thought I knew where the Boys Club was, and I kept going up this one-way street beyond it, and I couldn't get to the Boys Club. It used to be a two-way street, then it became a one-way street. So I got there like 45 minutes later than I was supposed to. And they said, oh, what happened? I got lost. What do you mean you got lost? You grew up in Pawtucket, you know? So that was my first exposure to urban renewal. And I thought, man, what a shame, you know, that I can no longer recognize the little area that I was so familiar with as a kid. The towns that didn't take advantage of the federal money in urban renewal are the ones who are now thriving because of their old buildings. A house tells a story, and part of that story is the growth from the beginning to the current day.
That's the journey that someone has to go through, understanding that this is not just a damaged or rotted piece of wood, but it's part of the story of the house. It's part of the legacy of the carpenter.
I guess I could start with the contemporary philosophy of preservation, which is to preserve what's there, regardless of its age, regardless of its condition, to try to preserve it. People lose sight of that.
Because there are plenty of buildings that are being treated as historic buildings and being rehabilitated. But when you walk into them, you're not fooled. You don't say, oh, they didn't work on this building, or, oh, look, they made a change, wait, yeah, I see what they did. Instead, you walk in and you see a new environment, basically, and the surfaces are all different, and many of the materials are new. When Steve works on one of these buildings that sort of is this sort of pure artifact, you don't get that. He's true and honest to say that if something had to be changed, we're not going to fool you that it didn't get changed, but in many cases, there is no change, that he found ways to work with the fabric and sort of seamlessly make the repairs and keep the building with that sort of patina of age. I'd say the building that, to me, best defined his ability to do that is the Moffett Mill.
Probably the single most interesting project we've done in quite a while.
And the greatest thing about Moffett Mill is, one, that it survives, and two, that when it shut down, when the last Moffett stopped working there, he basically closed the door and locked it and walked away.
And it appeared that people went home from lunch and he put a lock on the door because there were tools out, there were shavings from the lathe, there was a basket of kindling next to the stove. All the equipment was there. Everything was there. It was like a time warp.
Moffett Mill is a very rare survivor of basically the first generation of industrialization. It's a contemporary with Slater Mill, which is of course a National Historic Landmark as the first successful textile factory. Moffett Mill was built around 1810 as part of the spread of that new sort of factory-based water power operated mechanization out from Pawtucket. And we look at the Moshassuck River today, don't think it's a real big deal, but it was sufficient actually to run a small mill of the day. It's a little bit like an attic in that some things were just kind of put there and left there, but if you lift off that sort of random stuff, you can actually see the pattern of an early 19th century machine shop.
So anyway, what had happened over the years, this, like any old building, the sills started to go, the walls started to rot, and it had all its original fabric, outside and inside, except it was in horrible condition. The building was slowly tipping into the water. I think it was 18 inches out of plumb in 2 stories. So what we did was we racked it back into plumb, more or less. I think now it's like 1.5 inches out of plumb or something. And then we strengthened it by putting diagonal siding on, if I remember right, and plywood, and then covering it up with vertical siding.
From a distance, this looks like it was restored. Well, it looks like most of what's on here is original siding. But if you know, if you come and you examine this closely, we're not faking anyone out. We didn't up and down saw these boards, and we didn't use methods to make them look more weathered. We used techniques that will stand the test of time, but will also let people know 100 years from now that this repair was done and when it was done.
But it had a submerged turbine drive where the turbine was under the water, and the water would come in the mill race, hit the turbine and turn the shaft. It ran on a shaft up to a bevel gear on top to another horizontal shaft over to a bunch of what they call line shafts that have these wood pulleys on them, and the belts would go over that, and they would run various equipment.
And it always operated on the water power of the Moshassuck River. Originally with a vertical water wheel, which is located in the basement, remnants of which are there. It was replaced probably just before the Civil War with an iron turbine or a horizontal wheel, which is still in place down in the wheel pit. And early in the 20th century, they actually added a electrical generator so that they could generate not just the mechanical power to run the machines, but also electric power to light the mill. Moffett Mill is, the fact that you look at it and you don't think anybody's worked on it, is perhaps one of the greatest testaments to Steve's skill and sort of devotion to the preservation ethic.
I grew up in Pawtucket, in the Darlington section, which is the eastern section of Pawtucket. It was pretty much the same as it is now. It hasn't really changed much. It's a little bedroom community area that popped up after or during World War II. A lot of capes, small capes, and some ranch houses and that sort of thing. Typical of a urban sprawl, suburban sprawl, I guess you would say. From when I started the journal in early '66 to near the end of '76, which was almost 11 years that I'd been there, I was still working nights, and there was the prospect of staying there and working nights for the rest of my life, or taking a buyout, which they offered because of the computers. They knew that everything was going to be scaled down and they wouldn't need nearly as many people as they had. So they offered a buyout, and the offer was they would send you to school for 2 years, give you $200 a week, they'd pay for your schooling, plus they give you a bonus for leaving of $15,000. Well, in 1976, that was big money. 15 grand was a year's pay. So I took it, along with 72 others. We left on the same night. That's when I went back to school for 2 years. I graduated from New England Tech in drafting. I graduated from Roger Williams in historic preservation. And I went to RISD, took interior design courses. So I got my money's worth out of the education. It was hectic, you know, with 3 kids and trying to make everything work on $200 a week, but it was worth it.
Hey.
I met Jean in school. We went to college together. She was, we had classes together. We ended up going out and we graduated in '63 and we got married in '64.
My dad and my mom, from the beginning, she used to do all the paperwork, all the books, the payroll, all that, you know, and she still does some of that, you know, and yeah, you know, she lives in that 300-year-old house with my dad too, you know, so yeah, definitely an old house person, my mom.
How and when did you first meet Steve?
Oh God, so beautiful. Again, this George Waterman wanted to find a house, and I heard about one that was going to be dismantled. So he and I went to take a look at it, and who should be inside it but Steve?
A building came up for sale in Swansea. I ended up buying it, I forget for how much, not much, and I dismantled it. I took it apart myself. And in the process of taking it apart, I didn't know it, but a couple other people had come there and tried to buy it before I bought it. And one of the people, one of the interested parties was Ann Baker.
Every time I tried to find somebody to work with me, it was like really hard to find somebody who really was sensitive. And I wasn't that forward to him, but I just asked some sort of sideways questions, and I just couldn't. I said, "Have you ever done this before?" No. Wow, how do you know what to do? Like I didn't know what to do. And then he just, every question he answered was like, man, this guy must have been dropped from heaven. He's totally understands this house.
And she came in while I was working on the house, and she thought it was just amazing that the process I was using. Well, I had no idea what I was doing.
I started to need help some more. I can't remember how it all, which worked first or what, but I always call Steve, and Steve always and I worked together on all these houses.
She's a good person to work for. She's extremely enthusiastic about saving historic buildings.
Our big thing is whether or not that person has an old house soil. And that is the first thing that indicates what we're going to do in that house. First of all, we're going to have to teach them how to have, if we can, how to have an old house soil. I mean, those are our words all the time. Does this owner have an old house soil? Old house soil is based on somebody who instinctively understands what they've got.
Just happened to be reading a book. I guess it was Antoinette Downing's book on Rhode Island architecture. And I saw this house in there, and it said it was in Buttonwoods. I said, well, let me take a ride. So I came over here, I took a ride, and I went down Buttonwoods Avenue. And I looked up the driveway, and sure enough, it was still there, which kind of surprised me because the picture that was in the book was 1937. The history on this building is not very clear. The only clear evidence we have is that of Phones Green, who inherited the house, I believe, around 1705. Phones Green was he was a farmer, husbandman, and he owned the 140 acres, this peninsula of Buttonwoods. It sticks out into Greenwich Bay, a part of Narragansett Bay. And in 78, the house was quickly decaying. And I talked to people from the Historic Preservation Commission and told them that I was interested in buying the house.
My wife and I purchased a piece of property in Foster in 1997. Our original intention was to put up a new post and beam structure. And in the course of researching post and beam, I became aware that there were people that would purchase antique buildings or antique structures and rebuild them in new locations. I was always interested in old things, and I wanted to learn more about this. As I learned more, it seemed like this would be a possibility. Instead of putting up a new post and beam structure, maybe we could move, relocate, or purchase an old structure. There was a house that my family had rented in the 1970s from the Jocelyn family. The house was on about 500 acres. There were several other buildings, including the Jocelyn's residence. And the house was abandoned at this time. The city of Providence had acquired all 500 acres because it abutted the reservoir, and the water supply company purchased the property or acquired the property through eminent domain. And our timing was excellent because they were just about to auction off the buildings, including the house that we had rented back in the 70s. And in order to qualify for the auction, I needed to secure a contractor to work with me. So the first thing I did is I contacted the, I believe it was the Providence Preservation Society, and asked for recommendations. And I spoke to a number of people, including Steve Tyson of Architectural Preservation Group. It ended up working out that Steve Tyson was someone that we could work with. My wife and I bid, and the contractor Steve Tyson bid, and we won the bid. We won the house for $10. We began the disassembly process in 1998. Fortunately, Steve allowed me to help him out in order to save money. So I became responsible for documenting the building. We numbered everything. We began a process of documenting each room. We assigned a letter to each room, began at one corner and worked our way around.
Dad, bring it up.
We began the reassembly process in 1999. We began by digging the foundation hole, pouring the concrete, and then proceeding to lay out all of the components of the first and second floor, the sills and floor joists, girts and so forth. It only took about a day to lift the wall components off of the flatbed truck and put them onto the new foundation. So within about a day, maybe 2 days, we had all of the outside walls assembled, the roof assembled, and plywood on the roof. Then what was left was the chimney, all of the interior decoration and components, the walls, and of course the restoration.
I know when I first met you, contacted you, and worked with you,
Yep.
I had talked to a few other people, and I was, you know, what struck me about you was one, that you were willing. I mean, I had not a lot of money, so one was that you were willing to work with me, you know, and try to get it done for the amount of money I had.
That's
and
one of my biggest faults.
And also that you were willing to let me help, you know, by taking pictures and do drawings and do whatever I could to help. And those kinds of things struck me as unique. I'm not sure that everyone would work that way. Or
Well, we try to work that way, mostly for the sake of the building, you know? Because it may have been the difference between saving that house that you're in or not.
How did you eventually meet Steve Tyson?
Well, Mary Turkel was a customer of the shop, and she was the one who introduced me to Steve Tyson. So once I called them up, I came in here for an interview on that Sunday morning. I was 21 at the time. I remember being hungover and coming in, and he was listening to RIU, the blues station at URI. So we hit it off almost right away. I've had two characters in my life who I would call characters who have basically changed the way I am, and that was my grandfather and Steve. That me and Steve got along. We had the same mentality of the way things should be done. He asked me one time if I could go back in time, where would I go? And I said, well, if I can go back in time, it would be just before the Revolutionary War, 10, 15 years pre-Revolutionary War, just to see how things were done back then, how houses were built, what went into them compared to what is into them now. I mean, with the machines that are readily available compared to the hand tools back then, where everything was done strictly by hand. And same time zone that he wanted to go back in. And so we did. We had shared a lot in common. These are some of the cutters that we use strictly for the table saw, where it's basically a molding head that goes right on the table saw. I can make the knives myself by profiling what the molding is and making the knife up to the molding. The cutter sits right in there.
Yeah.
And flip the machine done, one shot, comes out piece of molding. You can see some of the moldings up on the wall. These are all some of the moldings that come off of the old houses that are all duplicated.
I'm a carpenter,
And how did
a painter, tin knocker. What else could I do? Bricklayer.
what did you do before you worked for APG?
Made better money.
Doing what?
I was in plastics.
What is it about living in an old house or working on an old house that you like the most?
It's cozy. It's been lived in. Not like your matchbox houses they got now. It's character. It's history. It's history behind it. Just makes you think.
If you don't preserve it, it could potentially become lost. And once it's gone forever. As a whole, new construction is very repetitive. But in restoration, it's a whole different animal. It takes a certain kind of person to appreciate it, and I don't know. It's more of a challenge, the creativity of it.
Wag.
More and more Southern New Englanders are listening to Cat Country 98.1.
Paul Dooley, foreman over here at the Seven Oaks job in Bristol, Rhode Island. I've been working for Steve and APG for 3 years now. Before that, I went to school for cabinet making and building construction over at New England Tech, and I've probably had construction in my family since I was born. The first time that I started working here, we actually started like ripping apart this house, and I had no clue really about old houses, the post and beam and all that, and I was pretty amazed how the house could be so destroyed, falling apart, and we could bring it back to life the way it was 200 years ago.
New construction is cookie cutter. It's there's not too much different going on there from building to building. In the preservation, you have, you never see the same thing twice, very rarely.
Well, the experience of working on old buildings has been a learning experience. There's so much history, obviously, in the structures, and there's a story usually behind every one.
I think it is important to preserve old buildings as closely to their original state as you can, just for obvious, not to repeat it, but the historical aspect, because
For example, Steve Sr. lives in one of the few remaining stone end houses in Rhode Island, which apparently there were many more of at one point, and they're lost.
Just taking Rhode Island as an example, there are neighborhoods that were built after World War II. There are neighborhoods that were built in the 50s with the screen doors that have people's initials on them, and there's examples of all kinds of architecture all over the state. Clearly, everything can't be preserved.
Why not?
Is that what you'd like to say?
Sure. Why not?
Instead of tearing down and building new, preserve.
Yeah.
What's there?
Adaptive reuse. It's common practice. We still have. I know land is finite, and we don't have a lot of space left, and people, I suppose, have to keep busy. But you can keep busy by doing adaptive reuse rather than tearing a building down.
I've lived here at 149 Congress since I've owned the house since 1979. It's an old 1869 Victorian. I enjoyed the details of it. I've done preservation work on it off and on for the last 25 years. As a matter of fact, in 1981 or 82, I received the first Elmwood Foundation Preservation Award for the work I was doing on the house. The cost of duplicating one of these is enormous. The idea of preserving it is the only reasonable way that will work. You can't build one of these again. One of the things that's really increased in Rhode Island has been tourism. And to be able to take tours of some of these old houses and explain to people the history of the houses or the history of the buildings has been a tremendous aid to the Visitation and Tourist Bureau. This is pretty unique. People come from all over the world to see some of the property that we have here in the Ocean State.
Why is it important to save the old buildings in the city and the old architecture?
Well, we have to look things from a historical perspective. As we know, there is the people who work in this city and live in this city. The majority of them were people who are struggling. New immigrants, Irish, Italians, Jewish, African Americans. They all help build this city. And the houses, the beauty of the houses is the history that goes with the people that were living there. Not only that, it's a beautiful house, nice painting, nice architecture, but there's also a personal issue there. There is a personal history, which is a touch that makes the fabric of this community so rich.
The most obvious change probably is moving away from thinking that only great works of architecture and things associated with the founding fathers or the colonial fathers or the first, the first patriots, those are the only things worth considering historic. I think there's been a very healthy broadening of the idea of significance and what is it that gives meaning to our society.
I don't think we have to preserve every suburb built in the 50s, and I still don't, once in a while I think about how would you do that contextually that would make sense. Do you do the ranch house, or do you really need the street to...
You really do need the street.
You really do need the street, and the lawns in front, and the wading pool in back.
What is the difference between Steve and another contractor, or is there a difference there something about him that stands out?
Well, for me, it's I think like he says often, you've either got an old house soul or you don't, and he certainly does. And for me, that's almost enough of an explanation. But to go further, it's someone who puts buildings in a way ahead of business.
Across the street from City Hall in Warwick sits the Warwick Central Baptist Church, a very old building, a very beautiful building that was losing all of its paint and was in terrible condition, and being owned by a church didn't have an awful lot of money to scrape sand, restore, and repaint the entire church. Had that been done, it would have been marvelous, but it was an eyesore. People in the community noted it as an eyesore. There was pressure on the church to do something about it, and the church decided that the best alternative for it economically, as well as a sort of compromise aesthetically in its mind, was to cover it in vinyl siding. In order to do that in a historic district, you needed to come and get special approval because vinyl siding generally was something that was prohibited. And Steve was very frustrated when the Historic District Commission reached the decision that the church could cover itself in vinyl siding as a sort of hardship exception, the idea that they didn't have enough money to do the best thing by way of historic preservation, so they'd be allowed to take exception and cover it in vinyl siding. That frustrated Steve, at least as the way he recounted it to me, because he thought principles of historic preservation should transcend ordinary mundane concerns like how much money a church has to keep up its budget. He was an idealist. Steve Tyson was the type of guy who could serve as the bridge between generations of Rhode Island historians and historic preservationists. Antoinette Downing to George Schuster is just a legend. But I knew Steve Tyson, and I talked to him, and he told me that story, and I knew that his life and work spanned Rhode Island preservation from its very beginnings with Antoinette Downing in the middle of the 20th century, straight through the 21st century. And his ability to form that link means that historic preservation itself is carried forward through the legacy of Steve Tyson.
If you have what I call old house soul, your first exposure or first experience in working on an old house doesn't really change much. You know, it's exciting the first time you do it, and it continues to stay at the same level of excitement. If it doesn't, then I probably would have gotten out of the business a long time ago.